And another one done. Oh my goodness, this is the second last one, and then all that's left is one more for this year. And this one was so great. It's one of my favorites. I just loved it so much. It's one of those perfect books. It's a perfect book. I did read this in October 2019 for the first time, but I only read about up to memory. So a little more than half of the book. And that's because in October 2019, I found out later that, like the week after I started reading it, that I was pregnant. And I think it was because of the pregnancy that the second half of the book I just couldn't keep reading. Hello, it's the end of the year. We're December. I cannot believe it. It's been a whole year since, almost a whole year since I started this. And I'm almost finished with the selection of books for next year. So if you would like to join me for next year, please sign up below. I will be releasing the video for what we're going to read next year very soon. This month, if you want to join me, you can reading The Life of Christ by Archbishop Fulton Sheen. It's a big one. I left it for the end, but I'm pretty sure Fulton Sheen is great. He's like C.S. Lewis. He's very accessible. He's a great read. So if you want to join me, please sign up below. There are some really good ones next year. Perhaps some that have been on your to read list. Oh, I know there are some. There's one big one that's been on my reading list for a while that I want to tackle, and I would love if you could join and tackle it with me. Anyways, back to the video. The Confessions. It's not just a biography of Saint Augustine. It's not just his biography, but it's more of a book of what it means to be a human being. The first half of it does deal with more of the biographical side. It is more, that we do learn about him and his life and about his mom. And the second half is more the philosophical aspect of it, and he gets into great detail, which I'm so happy I got to discover this time. So a quick note on translation and an edition. I have the Ignatius Critical Editions, translated by Maria Bolding OSB, edited by David Vincent McConey SJ, and the series is edited by Joseph Pierce. And this edition has footnotes, and it's so important to find an edition with footnotes because there are so many, not only for the historical aspects, to understand certain things about the time when Saint Augustine was alive, but also the references he makes to scripture. And it's just throughout the whole book, he references scripture. And if you're not like me, I'm not a biblical scholar or anything, my knowledge of the scriptures is not like Saint Augustine. And so, yes, sometimes it did happen to me several times when I would read a sentence and I would say, that sounds like scripture. And right beside it, there would be a number for the footnote and the reference would be there. Whoops. Saint Augustine heavily quotes the Psalms. It's everywhere. Every time you look down at the page, and sometimes there would just be half the page would just be footnotes, and all those footnotes would just be scriptures, referencing scriptures, particularly the Psalms. So if you haven't read it yet or if you have read it already, but there were many things that you didn't understand because either historical context, historical figures, or even if you're not a biblical scholar like I am not, it is really, really helpful to have that. Sometimes you just have super interesting footnotes about the times, for example, in Saint Augustine, in the time of Saint Augustine, feasting at the tombs of one's beloved dead was one of North African Christianity's favorite ways of celebrating. A pagan custom originally, the referendarium, from a term to refresh or cool, meaning here to revive the memory of the dead, could include celebration of the Mass, or it could simply refer to a funeral meal. So that's just so interesting. So I remember the first time I read this too, I didn't know much about the Manichees, and so that was very, very helpful the first time reading it. So that's on the translation. There is a new translation. I'm so gutted because I couldn't get it this time. It's a little expensive for now. But there's a new translation by Dr. Anthony Esolen. And if you've been with me for a long time, since the beginning, I love Dr. Anthony Esolen. It's just, so I can imagine, like, I haven't read any other translation of this because there are a few, but like I'm next time I read it, I'm going to get my hands on a copy of Dr. Anthony Esolen's translation of the Confessions, because that's the thing too. Saint Augustine wrote in Latin, but his Latin is poetic, and that is something hard to do. Like I speak Tagalog and English and French. English and French are better than my Tagalog, but I know what it's like to translate from French to English, English to French. It's hard. In general, translation is very difficult because you will lose, no matter what, a sense of whatever the original author meant, unless it's so technical, you know what I mean? But St. Augustine was very poetic, and there are very poetic passages in the Confessions. So I haven't read any of the other translations, although I'm so excited for Dr. Anthony Esolen's translation of it. I can't wait to get a copy of that. So if you have it, I'm not sponsored by Tan Books or anything, or they don't know me. Dr. Anthony Esolen doesn't know me, but I really like it, and because he is someone who understands poetry, and St. Augustine was very poetic. He wrote poetically. If you can get your hands on a copy of that translation, I would recommend. Just a note as well on his writing. When he writes, he often writes with dual meaning. So what I mean when he writes with dual meaning is that, for example, when he talks about his mother, he might talk about his mother, but it also means the church as mother. That's what I mean. He kind of intertwines the meaning, and I suppose it's more evident in the Latin because there are certain words that have dual meaning. From what I remember reading in the footnotes is that's why this is not his biography. It's ours. It's every human being's biography. And so when St. Augustine was welcomed by his mother's arms, it's a dual meaning, like my mother, my biological mother, but also the church as mother. On to my favorite parts, shall we? This time around, I really paid more attention. There were so many things I actually did not remember from the first time reading around. There were, for example, St. Augustine had two close friends, Lipsius, and I forgot the name of the other one. But they were very, very close friends, and they became clergy eventually. And they had such a knit bond, they kind of kept each other in check. And especially Lipsius, is that his name? My goodness, Alexis, you don't even remember. They kept each other in check, and he was a little younger than St. Augustine. And they prayed for each other, and he would just help him, get to where he needed to be. So that, for some reason, when I was reading it, I could not remember reading that the first time. I blame it on pregnancy brain. That, and also I paid much more close attention to Saint Monica's life, how he described her, and who she was for him, and what kind of person. Sorry, if you hear snoring, that's my daughter. She's snoring. She's on the couch. He didn't describe her as someone perfect. Like she did have her faults, but through and through, she kept praying for her son. And I think because I do have children now, this time around that I'm reading it, that's why I paid closer attention. The second half of the book, like I said, is very intense. I did have trouble staying interested in the part where he talks about time, because he talks about time, like what it is, what eternity means. He just takes a lot of time, no pun intended, on talking about what time is. It's the philosophical part of the book. There was a moment where I thought, it's a little too long. But I think it's just because at this moment in my life, it's not that it's bad. I think it's more where I am at in my faith and in my life right now. It's not speaking to me as it should. I feel like here's another thing too. I feel like this book would be great for teenagers. And you might think, okay, no. Teenagers, no. I think so. But it would have to be introduced by someone who loves Saint Augustine and who could actually give justice to Saint Augustine and what he says in the Confessions. Because especially the second half, I think the second half would be great for teenagers, because it does pose those questions that we all start asking when we're that age. There were two parts in the book, twice in the biography part, where really, when I was reading, I could feel my heart just, oh my gosh. And it's the climax of the part where he's just yearning, asking God, please take this away. It's one of the more famous parts. God, please take this broken sexual desire away from me, but perhaps not yet, right? At this point in the book, Saint Augustine understands God, and he understands that what he has is a disordered desire of lust. So he says, the truth is that disordered lust springs from a perverted will. When lust is pandered to, a habit is born. When habit is not checked, it hardens to compulsion. I had grown used to pretending that the only reason why I had not yet turned my back onto the world to serve you was that my perception of the truth was uncertain, but that excuse was no longer available to me, for by now it was certain. But I was still entangled by the earth and refused to enlist in your service, for the prospect of being freed from all these encumbrances frightened me as much as the encumbrances themselves ought to have done. I was thus weighed down by the pleasant burden of the world in the way one commonly is by sleep, and the thoughts which I attempted to meditate upon you were like the efforts of people who are trying to wake up, but are overpowered and immersed once more in slumberous deeps. For the law of sin is that brute force of habit, whereby the mind is dragged along and held fast against its will, and deservedly so, because it slipped into the habit willingly. Why must I go on saying tomorrow, tomorrow? Why not now? Why not put an end to my depravity this very hour? This is, I think, one of the reasons why people don't want to learn about God, is because you have to change, and change is scary. And what we don't realize is that whatever we have planned in our heads is nothing compared to what God has planned for us. And the wonderful thing about the Confessions, about St. Augustine, is that, God can take you out of it. You can't just rely on yourself. God is there. He will get you out. All you need is ask. Ask sincerely, with a sincere heart, ask, and he will save you. So I really like that. That part was like, and I understand, I want it to go, I want the sin to go, but please, maybe not now. It just gives me so much comfort right now. But we don't realize is that the sin is the punishment. It's not actual comfort, it's enslavement. And it, sooner or later, it's going to be to our detriment. And so if we want to be truly free, we must let it all go and give it all to God, as hard as it is. The change will be difficult, but it will be for our benefit. I went on talking like this and weeping in the intense bitterness of my broken heart. Suddenly I heard a voice from a house nearby, perhaps a voice of some boy or girl I do not know, singing over and over again, "Pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read. Pick it up and read." And so he picks up the Bible and opens it up, randomly. And this is what it said. He says, "I snatched it up, opened it and read it in silence, the passage on which my first eyes lighted. Not in dissipation and drunkenness, nor in debauchery and lewdness, nor in arguing and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh or the gratification of your desires." I had no wish to read further, nor was there need. No sooner had I reached the end of the verse than the light of certainty flooded my heart, and all dark shades of doubt fled away. And at that moment, it was taken away. And I can understand that. I have talked about in the past about having trouble with the sin of masturbation. And I was just crying, "Lord, please take it away." I cried out to Mary to pray for me, "Please take it away." And there's this just, you don't want it, but you can't. But it's your punishment. You did it to yourself. And the punishment of sin is the sin itself. And it's this aching to be with God just spoke to me. Saint Monica. Her husband was not Christian. He was more about worldly success. Her son got all that worldly success, basically. He was a great rhetorician. He had great worldly success, but also sinned a lot and was just lost. And Saint Monica's just kept praying. And in the beginning, she went to a priest and said, "Oh, could you please talk to Augustine? He's ruining his life. Can you please talk to him?" And the priest said, "Well, there's nothing really I can say. All you can really do is pray for him." And she did. And that's what she did. She just kept praying and praying and praying and praying until finally the Lord answered her prayers. When he describes Saint Monica, he doesn't describe her as a saint. He says that there was a time when she was a kid and she was quite pious, but though she was supposed to go get some wine, but every time she would bring the wine, she would drink a little bit and not say to anyone. But she was a faithful wife and a faithful mother. When she attained full marriageable age, she was entrusted to a husband. She served him as her Lord. But she made it her business to win him for you, by preaching you to him through her way of life. For by her conduct, you made her beautiful in her husband's eyes, as a person to be respected, loved, and admired. And as a wife, it's a great reminder. I've been with my husband for 14 years, married 12, and then got married in the church official marriage in 2018. But I've been with him for a long time. And yeah, there is nothing that nagging or telling, repeating words to your husband, most of the time, to get through to your husband, it's not by words, it's by what you do, and vice versa, right? And it's something we need to remember. We must show Christ through our way of life. And it's harder than that, that sounds. Because, talking the talk is easy, basically, but walking the walk is much, much more difficult. And so she was a very faithful wife and mother. I wrote down, the first time I wrote it, be more like Saint Monica. Second time I read it, be more like Saint Monica. I wrote down again. Such was she because you, her intimate teacher, instructed her in the school of her heart. Moreover, she was the servant of your servants, Every one of them who knew her found ample reason to praise, honor, and love you, as he sensed your presence in her heart, attest by the fruits of her holy way of life. She had been married to one man only, had loyally repaid what she owed to her parents, had governed her household in the fear of God, and earned a reputation for good works. She had brought up children in labor anew with them, each time she saw them straying away from you. Finally, Lord, she took care of all of us who were your servants, for by your gift you permit us to speak, who before her death lived together as companions in you after receiving the grace of your baptism. She took care of all of us as though all had been her children, and served us as though she had been the daughter of all. So that is a great example of when he's talking about his mom, but he's also talking about the church. All right, and lastly, in the philosophical part of the book, so I'll just take a few things that he said in the last part in the second half of the book, because I find I would not be able to give it justice. My favorite part was the end, when he takes a great chunk of the second half of the book, talk about Genesis and the first 4 verses of chapter 1. Anyone, however, who takes "in the beginning of God" made to mean nothing more than he first made, has no coherent way of understanding heaven and earth, except as the primal matter from which heaven and earth were to be formed. If though he means that God made first a formless and then a formed universe, there is nothing contradictory in his position, provided he is able to distinguish between what precedes in virtue of eternity, what precedes in time, what has precedence in order of choice, and what has a purely logical priority. Overall, then, there was darkness, simply because over it all there was no light, just as there is silence where there is no sound. What does it mean to say that silence reigns, if not that sound is absent? My favorite part in Memory is chapter 30, concupiscence of the flesh, sense of touch. And he talks about dreams, how since he had led this life of sin, it would come up in his dreams, perhaps just a simulation or maybe a memory, that is something that actually happened. Is reason shut down along with my eyelids? Is it lulled to sleep with the body's senses? Surely not, for how can it happen that often we do resist, even in dreams, remembering our commitment and standing firm in complete chastity, giving no consent to these seductions? There is notwithstanding so wide a difference between the two states that even when the opposite occurs, we return to peace of conscience on awakening. For the very difference between sleep and waking is obviously enough to convince us that we did not really do the disgraceful thing, even though we are sorry that it was some sense done in us. So he really does tackle everything. There are so many things that I left out, but this video would be so long. But I do highly recommend this for everybody. He does ask the questions. That's the great part, is that he does ask those questions that all human beings ask. And the answers are just so good. I definitely need to reread it and pay more attention to the second half, because I think my brain, just where I am, like I said, where I am in my life right now, spiritually and just in general, being a mother, I focused a lot on that. That spoke to me a lot more. But I'm sure perhaps when my kids are older and they ask me these questions, I will turn back to this book. This was a great book. I'm going to read it again. I say that all the time, but I have that new translation that I'm going to get my hands on to read. So what did you think? Have you read the Confessions? What was your favorite part? Anyways, guys, this was a wonderful read. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't read it, you must read it. If you have read it, please tell me what you thought, and I shall see you in the next one. Life of Christ, by the Most Reverend Fulton J. Sheen, Ph.D., D.D., the only person ever pre-announced. History is full of men who have claimed that they came from God, or that they were gods, or that they bore messages from God. Buddha, Muhammad, Confucius, Christ, Lao Tzu, and thousands of others, right down to the person who founded a new religion this very day. Each of them has a right to be heard and considered,
But as a yardstick external to and outside of whatever is to be measured is needed, so there must be some permanent tests available to all men, all civilizations, and all ages, by which they can decide whether any one of these claimants, or all of them, are justified in their claims. These tests are of two kinds: reason and history. Reason because everyone has it, even those without faith. History because everyone lives in it and should know something about it. Reason dictates that if any one of these men actually came from God, the least thing that God could do to support his claim would be to pre-announce his coming. Automobile manufacturers tell their customers when to expect a new model. If God sent anyone from himself, or if he came himself with a vitally important message for all men, it would seem reasonable that he would first let men know when his messenger was coming, where he would be born, where he would live, the doctrine he would teach, the enemies he would make, the program he would adopt for the future, and the manner of his death. By the extent to which the messenger conformed with these announcements, one could judge the validity of his claims. Reason further assures us that if God did not do this, then there would be nothing to prevent any impostor from appearing in history and saying, "I come from God," or "An angel appeared to me in the desert and gave me this message." In such cases, there would be no objective, historical way of testing the messenger. We would have only his word for it, and of course, he could be wrong. If a visitor came from a foreign country to Washington and said he was a diplomat, the government would ask him for his passport and other documents testifying that he represented a certain government. His papers would have to antedate his coming. If such proofs or identity are asked from delegates of other countries, reason certainly ought to do so with messengers who claim to have come from God. To each claimant, reason says, "What record was there before you were born that you were coming?" With this test, one can evaluate the claimants, and at this preliminary stage, Christ is no greater than the others. Socrates had no one to foretell his birth. Buddha had no one to pre-announce him and his message or tell the day when he would sit under the tree. Confucius did not have the name of his mother and his birthplace recorded, nor were they given to men centuries before he arrived, so that when he did come, men would know he was a messenger from God. But with Christ, it was different.